All right, I want to welcome you to the first Georgia CTSA Blue Sky Group of 2021. Blue Sky Groups are something we started several years ago to help people connect. And so we will choose a topic and ask for anyone who has any interest in the topic to join us in the discussion. These are unstructured meetings, so we actually want to hear what you have to say, as well as we're going to hear a little bit in the beginning of this one from some people who've had some success in this area. The idea of focusing on recruiting subjects virtually came out of a town hall that the university ran. And this came up as one of the major challenges that face our clinical researchers. So what we decided to do today was hear from three folks who have had some experience in recruiting folks virtually. We'll spend about 30 minutes hearing from our three speakers, and then we're going to open it up. And what we'd like to hear from you about things that have worked for you. We'd like to hear your questions. I see Neil Dickert is on the call. Thanks, Neil, for joining us. Neil runs the recruitment center for the Georgia CTSA. So you may have some insights, and we'll be able to listen to some of your concerns. So our three speakers today are Irene Yang, who's an assistant professor in the Nell Hodgkin Woodruff School of Nursing here at Emory. Madeline Hackney, who's an associate professor in the Division of Geriatrics and Gerontology in the Department of Medicine at Emory. She's also a research health scientist at the Atlanta VA. And our third speaker is Glenna Brewster Glasgow, who's an assistant professor in the nursing school here at Emory. So we asked them to share a little bit about what they've learned about virtual recruiting over the past 9 months. And unfortunately, even though 2020 is over, it looks like we're going to be facing the need for virtual recruiting for at least a few more months. So I'd like and potentially into the future, there may be some things that we've learned during the pandemic that we can take forward into some of our clinical research in the future. So with that, I want to turn it over to our speakers. Anybody want to go first in particular?
I think I had volunteered to go first.
Great.
So let me share my slides. Good afternoon, everybody. I won't take very much time, and I would like to start by saying I don't know about success at doing this, but a little bit of experience at doing it, and I certainly think I can provide some, share my experience to springboard the discussion. So what I thought I'd do today is briefly share how I transitioned one of my research projects to a remote virtual platform to accommodate this pandemic situation. This is an administrative supplement that I have through the Center for the Study of Symptom Science, Metabolomics, and Multiple Chronic Conditions, which is a P30 center at our school. My study investigates the contribution of oral health, the oral microbiome, and inflammation to the risk of mild cognitive impairment. And the population that I engage for this study are older African-American adults who provide caregiving for loved ones or friends with advanced cancer. This project is one of 6 that are housed inside the center. Actually, Dr. Brewster is also one of our center investigators, and each of the studies in the center transitioned at some level to a remote platform, depending on where they were in their implementation phase. And I see other investigators from our center as well, so I'm sure they'll be happy to share what they did to redesign their studies as well. So originally, the plan for the study was to recruit through 2 palliative care clinics, Emory and Grady. Clinicians at the clinics would disseminate information about our study, and then research team members would be present at the clinics to talk to patients and their families. We would then arrange to meet eligible participants at Wesley Woods, which was where we used to be located, for data collection which included clinical measures, a battery of surveys, cognitive testing, and then several biological specimens. We planned to collect subgingival plaque by inserting sterile paper points underneath the gums of the caregivers, saliva for local inflammatory markers, and then venous blood for untargeted metabolomics and systemic inflammatory markers. We had just launched and started to recruit when COVID hit, but we had not yet enrolled anybody. So when it started to dawn on us that this was going to last longer than we had anticipated, we decided to revamp our protocol in such a way that we could complete the objectives of our study while maintaining the safety of our participants and our research team. So now the participation in our study can be done entirely from the caregiver's own home with minimal to zero contact with our research team. In terms of recruitment, the clinicians that we originally partnered with still do disseminate information about our study and let families and caregivers know, but I think the fact that we're not able to have a presence in the clinic really does make a difference. And so we've really had to shift and are relying much more on Research Match and Craigslist. We recently launched a Facebook ad that I think we're going to continue to use, and then have started to reach out to community organizations like the Rosalind Carter Caregiving Institute to participate in caregiver support group webinars to let them know about the importance of oral health, but also let them know about our study. Now our informed consent form is on REDCap, and our research coordinator, Taquaya Alford, talks the participant through the REDCap form over the phone. Surveys are also located on REDCap, and we have found that that works really well. The participants are able to access and complete the surveys entirely. Some of them do it entirely on their smartphone, and some do it on another digital device. They can start and pause, and they do start and pause according to their own schedule, and we can monitor on our end where they're, how they're doing in terms of the progress of their surveys. We do offer the participants paper surveys that we can mail them along with our supply kit, but so far no one's opted for that option. Video conferencing has worked really well for the cognitive testing because we do need a visual interface for that. And then for specimens, like I mentioned, we mail them. When we see that the participants are done with their surveys, we contact them and let them know that we've mailed them a supply kit. And the supply kit has everything that they need to collect their own specimens, and that includes a very detailed instruction packet. We did have to modify the specimens that we collect. Saliva is now collected not only for the local inflammatory markers, but also for the oral microbiome and for untargeted metabolomics. The systemic inflammatory markers will now be extracted from dried blood spots, which the participants collect on their own by pricking their finger and dropping 5 blood spots onto this filter paper card. The participant then puts all of the samples into the packet. They know when we're coming to pick it up. They leave it in their mailbox or on their front stoop. So we have been at this since October. We've enrolled 8 participants. To be truthful, recruitment has been the hardest part, and I don't know if that's because of COVID necessarily, or that's just because recruitment is hard. Honestly, once participants are enrolled, this idea of remote or virtual data collection has worked very well. It's been pretty seamless. We try really hard to accommodate the participants' schedule. And they seem to appreciate the ability to fill out the surveys and collect the specimens according to their timeline and convenience. Of course, that means we have to be available when they are ready to do whatever part of the study they're doing. So it often entails us troubleshooting calls or addressing questions they're having, or doing the driving out to pick up the samples at, other than 9 to 5 kind of hours. And our study in particular requires a lot of interaction. So I'm very grateful for my research coordinator, who is either on the phone with the participants or texting them many, many times between enrollment and when we actually pick up the samples. For the most part, I think going remote or virtual has a lot of potential, and even beyond this pandemic. And it's been a great experience for me to explore how to do it this way. I'm not sure who's up next, but I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Irene. Before we move to the next speaker, I just want to see if there are any specific questions for you. If you have a question, please type the word question in the chat box, and we'll call on you and ask you to unmute yourself. Holly, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hey, thank you so much for that. This may be a silly, detailed question, but in terms of the texting and keeping people engaged, which seems so important, did you buy the research coordinator like a study phone with data plan? And how do you, protect their privacy when they're engaging with research participants in that way? And did you have to get any additional approvals to be able to text with research participants?
It is in our IRB, and we got her in a burner phone, so she's got a separate. I don't think it's a separate phone. I'm not sure if it's a separate phone, but it's a separate line.
Thanks.
Sure.
Thanks, Neil. Go ahead, Neil.
I was just going to ask quickly, you mentioned a handful of different outlets you were using: Facebook, Craigslist, Research Match. Do you have a sense of the folks you've recruited or the contacts that you've gotten? Where have they tended to come from?
I did take a look at that preparing for this. So they seem to mostly have come from our clinical contacts, so referrals from the clinicians. But then after that, it's been Craigslist and Research Match. Okay. And I do have to say, with we get a lot of calls through Craigslist. They don't always pan out to eligible participants, but we do get a lot of calls. And we got a lot of interest in Research Match as well. I think the problem was we started Research Match before the pandemic and then kind of didn't do anything with it until we revamped. And so by the time we reached out to all the people who had expressed their interest on Research Match, a lot of them we weren't able to contact them anymore. So I think that was one lesson we learned, is like, as soon as we get someone interested, we have to reach out to them right away in order to be able to maintain contact.
So Rebecca has a good comment that you can text with a Google Voice number as a way of protecting you.
True. I personally use a Google Voice number.
And then Olive has a question. Olive?
I work with a professor here at the Center for Family Research, and that's what I recruited a ton of African-American families, which now is finding more challenging. Not only with COVID, it's just because of just a lot of other things that are going on in the world. I was interested to know, we're in the middle of a P50 grant where we are going to recruit a ton of families. I need to know, what is Research Match? I don't know what that is. I was going to ask you to explain what that is. That's probably one of the few things I have not tried, is Research Match.
Neil probably can give better information than me, but it's basically, it's like a dating match only for researchers and participants, okay, where you can provide information about your study, which also has to include IRB approval, mm-hmm, the approved language you're going to use when you communicate with the participants. And then you provide different criteria, like what's the distance out that you want to perform your search, what kind of clinical criteria are you looking at, demographics. And then there are, at the same time as researchers enroll, there are people who are interested in trials and clinical research that also enroll, and then research matches you. And then you end up on your page, on your homepage, with like a list of people who are interested in it, and you can interface with them through that platform.
Okay.
And there's email contact and all that.
Can I just sneak in one more question while you're talking? Because I noticed you said you also recruit African American. Your study is focusing on African Americans. That's what all Dr. Brody's studies have. Dr. Jean Brody has all focused on African American research. Do you find it? You think you're having a little bit more difficulty because it's African Americans and African American and knowing just African Americans, the mistrust of the research process that they already have? Do you think that might be a problem?
That might be.
Might add to your.
Yeah, it might add to it. Our entire study, so Dr. Brewster will be able to speak to this too, because our entire center focuses on African Americans.
Yeah, that's what ours does too.
Yeah, yeah, that might be an element of that.
Okay.
So Neil wanted to comment to the chat box that Mugisha, I'm probably butchering your name, is the go-to resource for research match. Do you want to add anything, Mugisha?
Hi. Yeah, I think that was a good explanation. Yeah, Research Match is good because it's more active on the researcher side, because as the researcher, you are posting information about your study, but then also you're responsible for reaching out to the people and finding people who would be interested. And then you'll send them an initial message. And then if they're interested, they can click yes, and then you'll actually get their contact information to follow up. So it especially works very well for survey studies, where you can just kind of send a link to an online survey, or you'll have their contact information so that you can enroll them in your study and then have them come in for visits. But yeah, you can reach out to me. I'll put my email address in the chat. And I'm one of the liaisons for Emory for Research Match. So feel free to contact me if you have any questions.
Thanks. I think we'll move on to our second speaker now. I'm not sure whether Glenn or Madeline's going second.
I think I was supposed to go second.
Okay, I was going to ask if you want me to go second because I'm so aligned with what Irene
That's totally
about.
Okay too. You go ahead.
Okay. All right, so I'll share my screen. Okay, perfect. So yes, so I will also be talking about recruiting, enrolling, and conducting research virtually. And for me, I want to talk a bit about grant development, some changes that we made to our studies due to COVID-19, and then some tips to recruit and retain, and lessons learned. And because for us, we started recruiting pre-pandemic and we're enrolling into the study, my lessons learned really are based on pre-pandemic in-person somewhat recruitment, but things that we can also think about as we're enrolling people, participants virtually. So one of the things I've learned is that during grant development, we always think about, one of the things we think about is our sample. And when we are talking about our sample, writing about our sample, we're always told that, you go to the statisticians and you do your power analysis, and that allows you to get your N. And that is great to put in your study. But another thing that you should think about is the feasibility of recruitment based on the length of the grant. So for example, and the population that you're recruiting, if you have a 2-year grant and perhaps you're recruiting non-caregivers or African Americans between the ages of 18 to 65, those participants might be with no chronic conditions or any type of limitations. Those participants might be easier to recruit than if you have limits to your your sample. And if you're recruiting maybe for a 12-month period versus for a 2-year period, you might have a higher N versus, if you're recruiting for 12 months, you might have 50 versus if you're recruiting for 2 years, you might have 100. So I think, if your power analysis says more than that might be feasible, that might be one of the things to discuss in your grant or think about as you adjust your N. And for me, as I would say, I'm a pretty new researcher, that you might not even think about these things initially when you're writing your first grant. So one of the things you can do, maybe talk with mentors. A lot of times you're assigned mentors. So talk to your mentors about what their experience with recruitment has been. And when power analysis gives you a number, asking them about whether they think that this will be feasible over the time that you have and your colleagues. We don't only have mentors, but we have people who we collaborate with and work with. So then we can also talk to them and find out about the feasibility of recruiting the sample that we're going to include in our grants. For me right now, before the pandemic, I had 3 studies that were going on that were funded through different resources. So the first one was similar to Dr. Yang's, that mine was metabolic pathways to chronic conditions in Black caregivers of persons living with dementia. And we were supposed to recruit 50 participants over a 2-year period. And they were limited in that for my caregivers, they had to have a BMI of 30 and above with and without hypertension. So some had to have hypertension and some didn't, but everybody had to have a BMI of 30 and above. And so for us, this was pre-pandemic, we recruited and we screened 65, 45 were approved to participate, and 30 actually completed the first data collection point. And as we were going forward, the pandemic happened and we had to think about now how we were going to adjust what our data collection looked like. For us, as Dr. Young talked about, we were collecting actual blood. So we were drawing blood, about 45 milliliters. We were doing the measurements, the waist, the height. We were doing a finger prick, and we were also doing a metabolome, a sample from not the oral, but in this case, a rectal sample. So these were really hands-on in-person data collection. So we had to think about now, what would we do now that the pandemic was here? So that was the first study. The second study was cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. So this is, it's a 3-year study. Initially, it was funded by, or I have funding through the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center and the Alzheimer's Association. And this was supposed to be, we were going to randomize in person and video conferencing. So what we end up doing is, it was for diet. So persons living with cognitive impairment and their caregivers were going to participate. These are high-risk participants, so there was no way I was going to say, well, I'm going to come into your home and deliver this to you. So we then got IRB, well, we got the funders. We talked to them first, because a lot of times that's one of the things you have to do. You submit your grant to the funders and they approve you and they decide they're going to fund you for something. So before you make significant changes, one of the first things that you do is you talk to them to make sure, you kind of discuss with them the limitations that you now have. And we moved everything for the intervention online, and that was accompanied by some challenges too that I'll discuss. And then a qualitative study that we were doing where we had to recruit 10 caregivers, 10 persons living with cognitive impairment, and 6 healthcare providers. And for this one, we recruited almost everybody. This was a 1-year study that we had to do this recruitment over, and all we had to do was interview the participants about the intervention that we were using. So changes due to COVID-19. For the impact study, we moved our consenting online. So as Dr. Young alluded to, we have the REDCap online, and the Rinwa is my research coordinator. So she would call and speak to the participants and go through the consenting with them. I recently actually discovered Adobe Acrobat because we were having some challenges printing out the REDCap form to send after they signed it back to the participants. So with Adobe Acrobat, you can actually request the signature. So they sign, and then the research coordinator sign, the signatures are there, and then you can print it out and send it back to them. So we recently started using that, and it's pretty intuitive after you figure it out. And what we decided, because we were doing everything in person and we decided that we would no longer collect the blood or the rectal samples, but we would still do the questionnaires. So we finished our recruitment for that, but we collected the questionnaires for the final few participants. And for the intervention study, what we decided to do was everything. Now I had to figure out how to send all the packets to the participants. So it's a 4-week study. So each week would be in an envelope, and it's separated based on the person living with dementia and the caregiver. I had to add an additional visit for them because we have to go through with them how they will take out the questionnaires, what they do for the questionnaires, what they mail back for us, and then what we'll do each week and what they'll mail back for us. So for that, it was easier for me to get a FedEx account for the study. So we mail it to them, they fill out the questionnaires, they put the FedEx back on the envelope, and they return that to us. And we're also doing active watches. So we monitor their sleep with sleep diaries and the active watches. So at the end of the study, they're going to send those back to us in the envelopes with their questionnaires. And we are conducting the intervention via Zoom. And for us, setting it up and then explaining to them was pretty intuitive. It wasn't very challenging for the participants at all to really get on Zoom and participate in the intervention. So recruitment, now that we've moved online, we had done in person, and when we were doing in person, we attended a lot of community fairs that were hosted by churches and other local community organizations. And a lot of those have moved online. So even now, you can attend fairs that churches tend to organize online, and support groups we had done in person. And now I've actually, since COVID started, the Guayzata Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, they have weekly presentations, and those are attended, I would say, by 150 to maybe 250 persons per week. So I've presented my research there, and I've had interest from people who've attended. I've also presented for the Alzheimer's Association about my research. So I've done a sleep and caregivers presentation. We've had a Facebook page, and we've reached out to different people on in the dementia support pages there, and panel discussions that we've collaborated with other people across the US. So I've done a panel discussion for a group at UAB. And yeah, another thing would be to collaborate with colleagues to host or participate in events. So I have a colleague, Dr. Epps, who does different events with churches. So I've collaborated with her, where I've presented my research, then talked about sleep while we were at it, or reaching out to organizations. So, some churches are really open to presenting about, it doesn't necessarily have to be research. It could be something that would be educational and helpful for their congregations or sororities and fraternities, or even the AARPs. And what we have done to kind of maintain contact with our caregivers and our participants is that we know what their birthdays are. So we send them birthday cards, end of year cards, just to wish them, Happy New Year, season's greetings. And, it can be a physical card, or you can send it. We have all these online things now that you can use to send cards to, and sending them emails about the status of the study, or even pertinent things that may be helpful that we have done. And lessons learned. Incentives should be equitable to time investment to participate. So with us, it was initially, I think if you're participating for a study that might take at least 2 hours, maybe a $50 instead of $25. So think about incentives if the participants are going to be using enough of their time to answer the questionnaires. And some of the caregivers had unforeseen healthcare issues. So for me, I think mine had an additional complication because they were taking care of somebody living with dementia. So a lot of times caregivers might be taking care of their loved one, but then, not taking care of themselves as much. And then you have maybe unforeseen healthcare issues that might come up for them that they have to take care of. Or even when you're thinking about the person living with cognitive impairment or dementia, one morning they might wake up and they might not be having a good morning, or something unforeseen happens. They have to take care of that, and understanding that we have to be flexible with that, knowing who your participants and who you're recruiting. Fear, I've actually had one of the participants who said that, I don't have insurance, and based on some of the things that I might be asked to do, I'm not necessarily comfortable. And if something happens, and I don't know what I will do. So that fear about that, but then that fear about, what will be done with the samples that you take, and scheduling visits. So that goes along with employed participants. Some participants might be employed, and as a result of that, it might be challenging for them to find the time to actually come and do the study. And that was in person. But now we have less of an issue with that, because we can always send the link for them to fill out the questionnaires. And as Dr. Young talked about, when you make a contact, schedule the visit as soon as possible after that, because the longer you wait, then the more likely it is that it might be challenging to recontact the people who were initially interested. And then time-intensive community recruitment. You're recruiting people from the community, and because of that, it might require a bit more time than if you're going to a clinic where there's a particular sample who might be at the clinic who might be interested. So if you're recruiting people from the community, you might need more time than if you were recruiting from a specific place. And I think that was one of the things I wanted to talk about before I started my presentation, was to be aware of everything that we're going through right now. It's not necessarily normal. And for us, it can create some stress even as researchers, and that we need to give ourselves grace as we're going through this time period. And if we're giving ourselves grace, that we also need to understand that our participants might also and will also be dealing with the same emotions and the same things that we're dealing with. So if we, to be patient with the process, but also to know that, understand that they also might have all these other complex things that might be going on. So while they might not want to participate now, that at a later date when things may have calmed down or being different, then they might also be interested in that. And we can't do this alone, research and almost life in general is a team sport. So I've had a lot of collaborators and mentors, and at Emory, Dr. Hepburn, I think, is one of my biggest main mentors, and Dr. Griffiths. Whitney is on the P30, and I work really closely with her. Dr. Blythe, Kate Farron, and Christy Tower-Gilchrist. For my projects, Renwa is the main research coordinator, but Deanna has done really well with the overall P30, and we work closely with her. And I've been lucky to work with a few undergraduate students, and Morgan has been really good with putting my Red Cap database together. So I'm so happy that, she came on board to do that. And Sarah and Elizabeth, actually I'm working on a website for my lab, and it looks really great. And Elizabeth was the one who really was great in doing that. So students have been really good to work with. And we won't be here without our participants. So for me, it's persons living with cognitive impairments and caregivers. And the picture on the right is a picture of my grandmother and I. My grandmother actually has vascular dementia. So, one of my motivations to keep going when the going gets really rough, and it does sometimes. And my research is funded by, and I got a funding from an NIH supplement, the P30 pilot. The NYU, I have a pilot through the PRIDE program there, the Guayzata Alzheimer's Disease Research Center and the Alzheimer's Association. So I think that is it for me, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Glenna. Again, if anybody has any quick questions for Glenna, please go ahead and type the word question in the chat box. We'll have time for questions and discussion too after our third speaker. So I don't see anything coming up. So Madeline, do you want to go ahead and share your screen? If anything comes up quickly, we'll
Yeah, I'll go ahead and share out the screen. I'm sure there'll be a rich discussion after all three of us have gone. I want to commend my co-speakers because they've done a great job of talking about a lot of the recruitment opportunities out there that sort of remain to us. And so I don't want to be redundant too much. I'm just going to say we've done similar things, but I want to tell you a lot about what we've had to do to our trials just to be able to keep on going and function and do research. So let me see if I can share my screen and I'll go there. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, I just obviously need to go back. Okay, great. So you can see it, the presenter's view or the regular audience view, yeah?
Yes, presenter view.
Okay, cool. So yeah, we've done very similar recruitment methods. I can say a little bit about the three major trials that I've done this year that I've had to deal with. The STEADY trial, which is a CDC trial, doing a fall prevention initiative in the clinic, in the primary care clinics. It's a quality improvement clinic type study. And so we were originally recruiting in the clinic and we're no longer doing so. Actually tried to go back into the clinic, didn't work out so well because of COVID-19 actually. So our other methods of recruitment have become really, really important. All the emails and the texts and the phone calls. A lot of what we've done is actually, you know, not so different from what we did before because we always spent a lot of time on the phone when it came down to recruitment. The big thing that we're missing now is we can't do those research socials or go to a senior center and kind of, you know, promote our studies. We can't do these meetings together in large groups of people. And that's been a big detractor because that used to be like a major source of getting names and getting interest in studies because, you know, if you had a dynamic speaker who could present and get folks excited about research, then it was really effective. So that's been a bit of you know, a barrier, I suppose. But otherwise, we're still recruiting via databases and physician referrals and registries that we already have. Of course, word of mouth is always terrific. A lot of foundational listservs are really, really effective as well. And it's still, you know, the same thing of trying to get the word out. We also did try some health fairs. Some health fairs are still going on. But again, I believe attendance is a bit reduced from what it would have been pre-COVID. So I'm happy that I'm hopeful actually that we'll get back to being able to have these larger events because they were very, very effective and perhaps at getting folks who wouldn't have heard about it otherwise. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we had to do because changing everything basically has led to different things like changing eligibility criteria and otherwise, which does affect recruitment. So I'm going to talk to you about workshopping and finalizing tele-administration of study activities in my lab during the COVID-19 pandemic. So my lab does a lot of behavioral and rehabilitation research in Parkinson's, and I actually should have changed that to Parkinson's, Alzheimer's disease, older adults who are quote unquote healthy, like they don't have any other major condition like Parkinson's or neurodegenerative disease. We've also done work in older adults with low vision and African-American caregivers for people with dementia. So we've covered a lot of folks in the, you know, mostly older adults, 60 to 80-year-old range, as well as some middle-aged adults in their 50s. But in the past, we did an fMRI, we've done vascular imaging, we take blood, and of course we do in-person interventions. We use psychosocial, cognitive, and mobility behavioral measures, previously always done in person. So in the very traditional sense, you know, with the exception of maybe psychosocial questionnaires, which our participants could fill out on their own at home, but usually there was some sort of interview portion. All that had to be converted basically to telemotor or telecognitive or telepsychosocial measures. Some work out better than others. I want to tell you a little bit about that. I also do behavioral interventions. Our lab's big on interventions. We are known for an adapted Argentine tango intervention, but also exercise and walking groups, and studying or educational interventions as well that are designed to increase participation by all older adults in research. So COVID-19, of course, changed everything. One important thing is I mentioned adapted tango. So we used to have a lot of older adults come together and touch each other's arms, and they were about 2 feet apart to 3 feet apart, because that's partner dancing. That is the way it's done. So that has been a big challenge because my research and what our lab does is a lot about the touch and like what happens when older adults feel touch contact. And we actually tried to study that. It's of huge interest to us. And so this has been very impactful, like in every way you can think of. And so what we've done is things like we now use hula hoops, and you hold the hula hoop and the other person holds a hula hoop, so that creates more distance. But it's a different form of tango, but it's kind of working out. We're still piloting that aspect of it. But we're trying our best, right? And try to convert everything we can so we can keep on going and learn as much as we can about the research questions that we have, because they remain. And so it's been necessary to convert as much as possible to telehealth and convert our interventions to virtual delivery. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. We've had to define new parameters though. So we have new inclusion and exclusion criteria. You see, because we work with a population that's at great fall risk, people with Parkinson's, for example, their fall risk is like 6 to 8 times greater than that of a healthy older adult. And 1 out of 3 of them are going to fall this year, those aged 65 and older. So we've had to like kind of define though, like, is a patient going to be proper, or can they come in for telehealth? Or, I mean, do they need to come in, or are they going to be able to be seen with telemotor methods? And so we've had to like install new questionnaires and make choices about that so that we can have a good bet that they're going to be doing okay if we did a telemotor intervention or assessment. One thing that we've had to say is that if they do a telemotor assessment, for example, standing up from a chair as many times as they can in 30 seconds, is we've had to insist now or make a requirement that they have to have a person who is able-bodied who can either get help or provide help if needed. And so that kind of cuts down who we can recruit possibly, but we try to, once again, try to figure out different ways that we can do this. And they also have to have reasonable access to technology, meaning for the study project, for example, we want to do everything on Zoom if we can, but some patients can't get the Zoom to work. They just can't get the Zoom to work. We still want them to be eligible for the study. So what we can sometimes do is try to figure out everything we possibly can do by phone, or get them on the phone long enough so that maybe we can eventually figure out how we can get that Zoom technology to work in a series of shorter appointments. So we've had to be, very creative in that way and very flexible, and always seeing another way that we can jump through that next hoop. So I think I talked a little bit about limitations in terms of mobility assessments. Some are just simply not appropriate. For example, the Movement Disorder Society Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale, neurologists are not happy with doing that particular test by video. So they're still, at least from my studies for Parkinson's, the neurologists are saying they still need to be done in person. So this is something that we need to bring the patient in, of course, following all the PPE and COVID-19 regulation guidelines. But some mobility assessments may be like the tandem stance or the chair stand, that we've gotten ways that we can do this in a very safe way. So if a tandem stance is where you stand with one foot right in front of the other, we have them do this in the corner. That way, if they should have a little bobble, they can reach into the corner and they get caught essentially. And again, that able-bodied individual will be there. Physical assessments that just still have to be done in person. It's the way it is. The blood draws, fMRI, vascular imaging. We did discover that blood pressure actually is something that can be done by telehealth. They just need to have a cuff. So for example, in Steady Project, we mail them a cuff, and then they can go ahead and be taught how to use it with somewhat good reliability. Okay, so what we did was immediately to convert everything is we went to our experts, our mentor team, and our advisors and folks who know what they're doing. And we had a series of meetings. So we called upon geriatric specialists, physical therapy, neurology, neuropsychology, and exercise science specialists. And they helped share best practices from their clinic so that we could do this. By the way, neuropsychology, as my colleagues mentioned, it was actually easiest to adapt to telehealth. The cognitive assessments in many different assessments, it works out pretty well. We created safety procedures for the mobility assessments, and we've developed SOPs for all our procedures. We've had to completely rewrite all our SOPs, new addendums for telehealth. So the telemotor working group is something that we started immediately in the COVID pandemic, where we met on a weekly basis, inviting different experts to come to help us troubleshoot various issues. And we would just go through assessment after assessment and try to figure out how can we administer this safely in a telehealth environment. And I already discussed the chair stands. There's just specific things, specific new procedures that we ask them to do about camera angles and where you put the participant and how to get the participant there, etc., so that the assessor can tell if they're doing it correctly, but also safely. Safely is, I cannot underestimate how important that is. That always has to be in the back of your mind, especially if you're doing telemotor anything. But we were able to convert some things that are pretty standard, the timed up and go, the chair stand, a 360-degree turn test, to virtual assessment. However, before we have anybody do a telemotor assessment, we have them go through those criteria that I mentioned in a couple of different questionnaires to see if they would be actually appropriate for telehealth at all. Also, telecognitive working group, that was also weekly meetings with the neuropsychologists, experts, and study staff, and that went on for several months as well. And what we had to do is we actually had to change our neuropsych batteries for telehealth. A lot of the assessments that we had, the NIH toolbox, for example, we were not able to convert that to telehealth for various reasons. Maybe they've changed it at this point, but at that time it wasn't. And so we had to go through IRB approval and everything to change these measures so that they'd be appropriate for that. And we had to do a lot of troubleshooting, but now I feel very confident about our battery currently. What we've done with a walking group, that was one of my major interventions. It was going to be overground walking with buddies and back markers and with an instructor to make sure everyone's safe. And it starts out with a warm up. This is this sort of thing, but not with those big weights. A lot simpler than that. And then they would go for a virtual walk. And again, what we did was we brought on a physical therapist onto the team, Dr. Amy Morse, and an exercise physiologist and study staff, and we determined the best ways to do that. And we've been doing that for several months with some practice participants, and it's been going really well. And so some of the differences between in-person and virtual: location is still overground outside walking in a safe senior walking appropriate areas, still about groups of 4 to 6 participants, but the warm-up is now delivered over video conference, like, you know, Jane Fonda back in the day. A little bit different. We're a little bit more interactive as much as possible, but there's a lot of technology things to overcome, like sound, talking over music, these sorts of things. But then the walk itself is delivered, there are cues that are delivered by phone conference, and it's worked reasonably well, again, with some technology issues. What we have determined over this, if you're going to do a virtual session, like a walk, for example, you have one person be the co-lead and who's handling all the technology and sort of running the Zoom meeting, whereas the instructor is focusing on just working on the instruction itself. I also do Tango. I told you about the adaptive Tango. We've had to convert it to Teletango. There's a few more differences here. Group sizes are now smaller. We used to have like 10 or 11 participants in a class plus 11 partners or so. So it was very efficient. We could get 20 or so people, you know, trained per week. And now we're having to go down to 4 to 6 because of the virtual. You just simply can't monitor 20 patients all at once. And so this is all very, very challenging. And it means, you know, the study is going to be slower. We're not going to be able to recruit or test people as fast or train them as fast as we might have in the past. But we're doing our best. And in long term, it will probably increase the reach of this program because more people will be able to have it, because we can do it across state lines. We can do it nationwide, perhaps internationally. So there are pluses and minuses to what's been going on. Navigating technology is super, super important. And like that's changed the eligibility criteria. And who's going to come to our study if they have to do everything on Zoom now? this has actually been a drawback. And so in terms of recruitment methods, we've had to really, really fine tune our Zoom methods, because it's not just so simple, especially not for a senior population, to just adapt and adopt all these new methods. And so these are things that we've had to deal with a lot and still working on, but I think we're getting there. We did administer a technology survey to a group of patients. These are practice participants from a registry I already had. And they were actually pretty comfortable with it in using a smartphone and a computer and a video conferencing software. However, I would say these are probably on average folks with a higher SES, mid to higher. And this matters a lot for our lower income population and those who are, don't have so much computer access. And that's something we really, really need to think about. And I saw that, a lot of folks were, we want to address disparities and other sorts of things, and we want to get as many people into studies as possible. So we're going to have to be really creative about how, if this is what we're going to do going forward more and more, we need to make sure that those who don't have access to technology are not excluded because of that. That's just unacceptable. So camera handling, just FYI, by a patient or caregiver should be minimized, especially if we're dealing with an older adult population. Don't try to make sure it's a nice laptop just sitting there. Laptop computers are best for pain and balance assessments. Instruction calls are imperative. We're doing a lot more talking on the phone, just talking and talking. We already did a whole bunch of that. As far as recruitment, one of the things I always loved, I had a great recruiter. I have great recruiters right now, but the ones who are willing to talk to folks, especially now, they're really kind of happy to hear from you. It's like time. It's just the time. Take it. I think it'll make a big difference. A simple phone call makes a big difference in a lot of people's lives. And there's some increased benefits. You can see home safety risks if you're seeing in the home. Patients may be less stressed and experience less white coat syndrome. If you need to see their medications, they're on hand, and you might have more time with the patient ultimately. And that's about it. I can talk more about recruitment, that's specific to the different studies we do. I just want to make sure y'all understand. I have one study that's recruiting MCI patients, another one that's Parkinson patients, and then of course the older adults in the CDC steady study, which is the quality improvement. The partner and paired, the one with the MCI patients and MPD patients, that's an R01 and a VA merit. And those are both traditional studies, research studies with. And so this is my team. I'm so grateful to them, and of course the funding. And we'll take questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Madeline. We will do questions. We only have about 5 minutes left. So the questions can be to any of our speakers or to the group in general.
You go ahead and stop.
Mara, go ahead with your question.
Hi. So, okay, so I'm really grateful for this opportunity. What I do want to know, and this is a question for any presenter or anyone in the chat really, is there a central location to find best practices to reach participants virtually based on different criteria? Like I know a lot of the work that the presenters were working on were with people who were in advanced age. Is there any database to be like, based on this criteria, you can do this intervention to get the best outreach?
If I knew about that, I would definitely consult it personally. I'm fighting having to make my own SOPs and MOPs, but hopefully, yes.
Oh, and
Kathy, I can add.
Neil, go ahead, Neil.
I was just going to say the Georgia CTSA Recruitment Center is trying to build a resource just like what you mentioned. I think one of the things that's super clear about your question and about the presentations is that all of this is context specific, right? The right strategy is going to be different for one patient population or one participant population for another, and based on the type of study. We're trying to grow experience by helping teams use different methods to reach out. So to say that there's a clear source of best practices is a bit of an overreach, but to say that we're accumulating knowledge and want to help and grow with teams to be able to provide resources for specific types of outreach, we're definitely in business to do that. Mugisha Niabizi is on the line, and she is our sort of point person for the overall recruitment center. And we have folks at Morehouse School of Medicine, University of Georgia that we partner with too. So we're trying to grow that. And we also have a Slack platform that's designed to provide discussion among coordinators and other members of research teams to be able to share those kinds of information. And we can pull in information from the national dialogue too. So, so the short answer is yes, we're here to help in all of those ways, and to learn with you guys and to kind of build that knowledge base.
Thanks, Neil. Kim?
Okay, thank you. I'm wondering if there's anyone who can quantify the actual effect on recruitment, this eligibility of having to have an able-bodied person there for some of these virtual protocols. How did that really, like numbers-wise, do you have any info on that?
So what we do is we say, we have a phone call, and we say, you need to have this person. Can you arrange for that individual to come? But that's a great question, and that's something that we are tracking, and we're going to try to answer with the CDC study project. That's that exact question. But we try to everything we can. It's like, within a couple of days, and it doesn't have to be like their adult child or best friend or someone who lives with. It could be literally anyone that they can make sure is there. And I think that kind of has taken care of a lot of people, but it will certainly impact some.
Thank you.
And if it's a more than once kind of situation, like my studies when they used to have that, like we would try to encourage them to bring a partner, we would always end up providing partners for them in some way. But I know that it does affect. It affects a lot of dementia studies, I'm sure, because study partners are often required.
Okay, one last question from Ebony, and then I would also direct your attention to the chat box where Mugisha put up information on how to contact the Georgia CTSA for advice on recruiting. So Ebony?
Yes, it actually is not a question. I wanted to offer a suggestion for a resource that we're going to use. I work in the P30 Center, and we haven't started with active recruitment, but one of the resources that I didn't hear mentioned that I think is going to be very valuable is the Microsoft Teams booking app. And so we'll be scheduling our visits through that bookings app. And what that does is it syncs to your Microsoft Outlook calendar. So any appointments or meetings you already have, patients won't be allowed to book during that period. And it has a lot of different capabilities. I can send links to videos for specimen collection. It also has the ability to send reminders, which I've set, as well as they can opt into receiving text messages as well. So if you haven't started migrating and using Microsoft Teams, it has a lot of capabilities that I think are very, very useful for remote research participation.
Cool.
Thanks for that suggestion, Ebony. And with that, we're going to end for today. I want to thank our three speakers for sharing their experiences, and Neil and Mugisha for sharing the resources of the CTSA in terms of recruitment. So we wish you luck with your study. Please feel free to reach out. We can help put you in touch with people. If you need there's another note that Doximity is another phone option for recruiting. So thanks for coming today. We hope this has been helpful for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.